The first warning sign didn't come with raised voices or an argument. It arrived wrapped in a pleasant smile, spoken so calmly that anyone listening might have mistaken it for friendly conversation. "Once the wedding is behind us," my son's fiancée said while sitting at my own kitchen table, "the house should really belong to us. After that, you'll have your own life somewhere else." Then she gently pushed a prenuptial agreement across the table as casually as if she were offering dessert. She had no idea I had already spotted a carefully written clause referring to property my son hadn't inherited or even owned. She also couldn't have known that I had spent 41 years as a bridge inspector for the Washington State Department of Transportation. My career had been built on discovering tiny structural weaknesses everyone else overlooked. After enough years, you stop believing cracks appear by accident. The same is true for people. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm 68 years old. I retired after more than 4 decades studying steel, concrete, and foundations across Washington State. Until recently, I believed bridges were the most complicated structures in the world. I was wrong. Families are far more complicated. A bridge gives you warning before it collapses. A family can look perfectly strong while already falling apart beneath the surface. Only a few weeks before that conversation, I was washing leaves off my backyard deck when my son unexpectedly pulled into the driveway. Nathan climbed out in his SUV wearing the biggest smile I'd seen in years. Standing beside him was a woman I had never met. "Dad," he said proudly, "this is Olivia Harper." He slipped his arm around her waist. "We're getting married." For several seconds, I honestly thought he was joking. Nathan was 35 years old. He researched everything. He compared prices before buying coffee makers. He spent months reading reviews before replacing a television. Yet somehow he had become engaged without ever mentioning he was seriously dating anyone. Olivia walked over with complete confidence, shook my hand, and introduced herself with flawless manners. "Mr. Lawson, I've heard wonderful things about you." Everything about her appeared polished. Her clothes were tasteful without being flashy. Her voice was warm. She looked me directly in the eye whenever she spoke. Anyone watching that first meeting would have assumed my son had found the perfect woman. For a little while, I almost believed it too. While I prepared coffee in the kitchen, I could hear Nathan showing her old family photographs hanging in the hallway. He pointed out the rocking chair my late wife used every evening. He showed her the small woodworking shed where he and I had spent countless weekends building birdhouses together when he was a child. Olivia barely looked. Instead, she asked how much land surrounded the house. She wanted to know whether property values in the neighborhood had continued increasing. Then she casually asked whether I had ever considered selling now that I was living alone. None of those questions sounded rude. They simply weren't the questions I expected from someone supposedly in love with my son. After we carried our coffee into the dining room, Nathan opened his briefcase. "We've already started planning everything," he said happily. "Olivia suggested we sign a prenup. Full transparency, protection for both of us." He handed it without the slightest hesitation. I adjusted my reading glasses and quietly began turning the pages. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Standard legal language, routine financial protections, nothing unusual. Then one paragraph caught my attention. A few pages later, another sentence did the same. The wording expanded future marital assets to include inherited property under certain conditions after ownership became legally intertwined. It was written with remarkable precision. Most people would never notice what those sentences were actually doing. I finished reading, closed the document, and calmly handed it back. "It looks very detailed," I said. Olivia studied my expression before smiling. "I believe successful families always plan ahead." Successful families, not loving families, not happy families, successful families. That choice of words stayed with me long after they drove away. Later that evening, I carried the agreement into my home office and read every page again. This time, I wasn't reading it as a father. I was reading it the same way I'd spent decades reviewing engineering blueprints before approving construction. Tiny details rarely matter by themselves, but when enough of them point in the same direction, they become impossible to ignore. I picked up a red pen. 3 separate clauses received circles. Across the top of the first page, I wrote a single question. Why? At that moment, I still believed I was simply being an overly cautious father. I had no idea that answering that one question would eventually force me to uncover a carefully planned scheme before it destroyed my son's future. 3 weeks passed. I behaved exactly the way Olivia expected me to. I complimented wedding venues, I smiled through conversations about flowers, guest lists, and reception menus. Whenever she mentioned the prenup, I simply nodded as though I'd already accepted every word inside it. If she was watching me closely, I wanted her to believe she had no worries to have. Then, everything changed on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A retired coworker invited me to lunch at a steakhouse in downtown Seattle to celebrate finally leaving the engineering business for good. Old habits die hard. After spending 40 years arriving early for inspections and meetings, I reached the restaurant almost 25 minutes ahead of schedule. The hostess seated me near the front while I waited. As I glanced towards the back of the restaurant, a familiar figure walked through the entrance. Olivia. She wore dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather and a navy-colored coat. But she wasn't alone. A man who looked to be somewhere in the mid-40s immediately stood when he saw her. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. Not the polite greeting between coworkers, not the quick hug of old friends. It was effortless, comfortable, natural. The kind of greeting shared by two people who had repeated it many times before. They laughed together before sitting down. Within seconds, they seemed completely unaware that anyone else existed inside the restaurant. For one brief moment, anger nearly took control. I wanted to call Nathan. I wanted him to walk through those doors and see everything with his own eyes. Instead, 41 years of engineering overcame 5 seconds of emotion. You don't condemn a bridge because of one visible crack. You condemn it after proving every crack belongs to the same structural failure. Quietly, I asked the hostess if I could move to another table with a better view. She happily agreed. I opened a news article on my phone to avoid attracting attention while activating the camera. Over the next half hour, I documented everything, their hands touching across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist while she laughed, the way she leaned closer every time he spoke. Nothing looked accidental. Nothing looked professional. They weren't trying to appear affectionate. They simply forgot anyone might be watching. When lunch ended, they didn't leave together. Instead, Olivia walked out first. Almost 2 minutes later, the man followed. That decision told me almost as much as the photographs themselves. People with nothing to hide don't carefully stagger their departures. I remained inside until they reached the parking lot. From a distance, I watched the man climb into a black BMW parked several rows away. Before he drove away, I photographed the license plate. A few minutes later, my retired coworker finally arrived. He apologized for running late. I smiled politely. We ordered lunch. I barely tasted a single bite. My mind had already left the restaurant. That evening, I called an old friend named Daniel Brooks. Daniel had spent more than 30 years working as an investigative journalist for the Seattle Times before retiring. If anyone could quietly identify the owner of a luxury vehicle without asking unnecessary questions, it was Daniel. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. "The BMW belongs to Cameron Blake," he said. "He's a luxury real estate broker." Daniel paused while checking another note. "Works almost exclusively with wealthy clients buying high-end properties." The name meant nothing to me. One fact, however, refused to leave my thoughts. Earlier that morning, Olivia had told Nathan she was meeting a bride to discuss floral arrangements. Instead, she had spent the afternoon laughing over dessert with another man. That alone raised serious questions. But questions aren't evidence, and I wasn't about to destroy my son's future because of assumptions. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed with excuses, tears, or clever explanations. The following morning, I drove to a small brick office just outside downtown Seattle. A brass sign beside the entrance read, "Michael Carter Investigations." Michael listened without interrupting while I placed the photographs, the copy of the prenuptial agreement, and Cameron Blake's name on his desk. When I finished speaking, he silently examined the pictures for nearly a full minute. Finally, he looked at me. "Mr. Lawson," he said quietly, "are you trying to prove she's cheating on your son?" He paused. "Or are you trying to prove she's dangerous?" I met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm trying to discover which answer will save my son's life." Michael slowly closed the folder. He leaned back in his chair before giving a single nod. "Then don't confront your son yet. Give me 2 weeks." I stood to leave. Just before I reached the door, he spoke one final sentence. "If my instincts are right," he paused, "you won't be bringing your son a wedding gift. You'll be bringing him evidence." Exactly 14 days later, at 8:14 on a Monday morning, my phone rang. It was Michael. His voice sounded unusually flat. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. Can you come to my office?" That was all I needed to hear. People don't protect you from good news. When I arrived, a thick black binder rested neatly in the center of his desk. Michael didn't hand it to me immediately. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee, sat across from me, and quietly said, "Everything inside this report has been verified through surveillance, public records, legal documents, financial research, and independent witnesses. Nothing here is speculation." Then he opened the binder. The very first document inside the binder was a certified marriage certificate. Olivia Harper, married to a technology entrepreneur named Brandon Ellis 4 years earlier. I kept reading. 17 months after the wedding, she filed for divorce. The settlement awarded her a substantial 6-figure payment. I turned the page. Another marriage certificate. Another husband. His name was Christopher Morgan, a commercial real estate investor from Portland. Different city, different man, almost the exact same timeline. A carefully negotiated divorce, another large financial settlement. I continued turning pages. The similarities became impossible to ignore. Every relationship moved incredibly fast. Every engagement included a highly detailed prenuptial agreement. Every marriage ended shortly after financial protections shifted in her favor. Michael quietly placed several photographs beside the binder. Each one showed Olivia with Cameron Blake. They entered the same boutique hotel on 3 separate evenings during the previous 2 weeks. Another photograph showed them leaving together the following morning. The timestamps weren't separated by hours, only minutes. "They've been involved for at least 10 months, Michael said. I looked up. "Longer than she's known Nathan?" He nodded once. "Several months longer." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I wasn't looking at evidence of an affair anymore. I was looking at evidence of a pattern. Michael turned another page. "Legally, we couldn't obtain private bank records," he explained. "But travel records, business registrations, hotel reservations, surveillance, and public filings tell a very clear story." He tapped one page with his finger. "Cameron Blake isn't simply another man in Olivia's life. He appears before every engagement, he disappears during every marriage, and he quietly returns before every divorce." Michael leaned back. "In my professional opinion," he paused carefully, "they're not hiding a relationship, they're operating together." I slowly closed the binder. My hands rested on the cover while my thoughts raced. Nathan hadn't accidentally fallen in love with the wrong woman. He had been selected, observed, studied. Every conversation Olivia had started about my retirement, every question she asked about my house, every smile she offered across my dining room table, every compliment, every perfectly timed display of kindness, it all fit together now, like pieces of the same blueprint. Michael reached into his desk drawer and handed me another envelope. Inside were printed schedules from professional networking events, business conferences, real estate seminars, charity galas, speaking engagements. Every event Olivia claimed had helped her career. Every event Cameron Blake had attended. Their calendars overlapped with remarkable consistency for nearly 3 years. Michael folded his hands. "There's something else." He paused. "I located 2 men whose experiences closely resemble your son's. If you're willing to continue, I believe both of them would speak with you." I looked down at the binder one last time. Then I answered, "No." Michael frowned slightly. "No?" I stood, tucked the binder beneath my arm, and met his eyes. "We're finished searching." For a second he looked confused. Then I finished the sentence. "From this point forward, we're building a case." I left his office carrying enough evidence to destroy a wedding. But destroying a wedding wasn't my goal. Saving my son was. Those are two very different things. That same afternoon, I drove across town to meet Elizabeth Warren, not the politician, a family attorney I'd trusted for almost 20 years. Elizabeth had spent more than 30 decades protecting clients from financial exploitation. If anyone could separate emotion from strategy, it was her. She read Michael's report without interrupting. Occasionally, she underlined a sentence. Sometimes she made notes in the margin. When she finished, she quietly closed the binder. "If you confront Nathan today," she said, "Olivia will convince you an aging father who's afraid of losing control. You'll lose your son's trust, and she'll gain even more influence." Deep down, I already knew she was right. Hearing someone else say it only made the truth harder to accept. "So, what do we do?" I asked. Elizabeth slid the prenuptial agreement toward me. "We stop arguing with suspicions. We start collecting facts she can't explain." She outlined the plan with remarkable precision. Every conversation with Olivia would be documented. Every financial discussion would be carefully recorded. Every inconsistency would become another piece of evidence. Washington allowed one-party consent recordings. That meant I could legally record any conversation I personally participated in. Before leaving her office, I purchased a professional voice-activated recorder. I tested it 3 different times before driving home. 2 days later, Nathan and Olivia came over for Sunday brunch. She arrived carrying pastries from an expensive bakery. Her smile looked exactly the same as it had the day we first met. If I hadn't seen Michael's investigation, I probably would have believed every expression on her face. The recorder rested silently inside my shirt pocket while we discussed seating charts, honeymoon plans, and wedding decorations. Almost 20 minutes later, exactly as Elizabeth predicted, Olivia gently shifted the conversation. "Richard," she said warmly, "have you thought about updating your estate plan? Families change. Important documents should change too." I shrugged casually. "I've been meaning to." Her eyes brightened for a fraction of a second. "You should probably do it sooner rather than later. I've seen families lose enormous amounts of money simply because paperwork wasn't organized." Nathan smiled proudly. He genuinely believed she was looking out for me. I noticed something entirely different. She never once asked what I wanted to do with my retirement. She only wanted to know what would happen to everything I owned after I was gone. During the next 2 weeks, Olivia called me 4 different times. Every conversation began with wedding details: the florist, the photographer, the seating chart, the honeymoon. But sooner or later, every single call drifted back to my finances. Had I already chosen beneficiaries for my investment accounts? Was the house still in my own name, or had I placed it into a trust? Had I considered making things easier for Nathan by simplifying future ownership? Each time I answered with polite uncertainty. Each time the recorder quietly preserved every word. By the end of the 2nd week, the pattern had become impossible to miss. Elizabeth listened to every recording before placing another file into the growing stack of evidence. "She's becoming impatient," she said. "People become impatient when they're working toward a deadline." "The wedding," I answered. She nodded. "Exactly." Before I left her office that afternoon, she handed me another folder. 2 names were written neatly across the front: Brandon Ellis, Christopher Morgan. "The former husbands," I said. "They're more than names now," Elizabeth replied. "I found both of them." I stared at the folder for several seconds. If those 2 men were willing to speak, I had a feeling Olivia Harper was hiding far more than we already knew. I met Brandon Ellis on a quiet Wednesday morning at a small coffee shop overlooking Lake Union. He arrived 5 minutes early. He looked like someone who had spent years trying to bury a painful chapter of his life. At first, his answers were careful, guarded, almost defensive.
Then I placed a recent photograph of Olivia and Cameron Blake on the table. The color completely disappeared from his face. He stared at the picture for several long seconds before quietly exhaling. "So," he barely whispered the words, "he's still with her? I should have known." Brandon explained that Cameron had introduced himself years earlier as nothing more than a business associate. He always appeared just often enough to seem harmless, never enough to create suspicion. By the time Brandon realized they had been working together, the divorce had already cost him years of savings and a vacation cabin his parents had left him. "She never pressured me," he said quietly. "She made every decision feel like it was my own idea." That sentence stayed with me because Nathan had been saying almost exactly the same thing for weeks.
Before we left the coffee shop, Brandon signed a sworn statement describing everything that had happened during his marriage. He also agreed to testify if necessary. 2 days later, I drove to Portland to meet Christopher Morgan. Unlike Brandon, Christopher didn't look surprised when I mentioned Olivia's name. Instead, he laughed once. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the exhausted laugh of someone who had already learned how expensive misplaced trust could become. Without saying much, he opened a filing cabinet beside his desk and removed a thick folder. I've been waiting years for someone to ask. Inside were emails, settlement agreements, financial documents, handwritten notes, copies of conversations. Everything looked painfully familiar. The same compliments, the same carefully timed discussions about estate planning. Even the wording inside his prenuptial agreement closely matched Nathan's, page after page, almost line for line. Before I left, Christopher looked directly into my eyes. "Your son still has time," he said. I didn't. Driving home, I realized I was no longer looking at isolated stories. I was looking at a carefully refined system, one that had been perfected over years until almost no one recognized it before it was too late. That afternoon, I met Elizabeth again. She carefully added both sworn statements to our growing evidence file. Then she slid another stack of legal documents across her desk. "Now we protect your side." For the next several hours, we updated every estate document I owned: my home, my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, everything. Together, they were transferred into a protected family trust with strict distribution rules that prevented any future spouse of Nathan from gaining direct or indirect control. Even if Nathan married Olivia the next morning, she wouldn't receive a single dollar from anything I'd spent my life building. Elizabeth signed the final document and smiled for the first time since we had begun working together. "Legally," she said, "she's already lost." I nodded. But winning in court had never been my goal. I wanted Nathan to walk away before he ever needed a courtroom. As I gathered the paperwork, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Nathan. "Dad, Olivia wants us all to have dinner Friday night. She says it's time we finally start feeling like one family before the wedding." I showed Elizabeth the message. She smiled immediately. "Go. People become careless when they believe they've already won." Friday night's dinner proved every prediction she had made. Olivia greeted me with another warm hug. She complimented the wine I brought. She thanked me for supporting the wedding. For the first half hour, she played the role of the perfect future daughter-in-law. Then, little by little, the conversation changed. She asked whether I had updated my estate plan yet. She wondered whether Nathan had already been added to my investment accounts. She even mentioned how much easier family relationships became when financial matters were organized before unexpected problems occurred. Nathan never noticed how carefully she guided every subject. He simply smiled proudly every time she spoke. I answered each question with the same practiced uncertainty, while the recorder hidden inside my jacket captured every word. By the end of dinner, Olivia believed exactly what I wanted her to believe, that I was an aging widower who knew very little about trusts, estate planning, or protecting assets. She walked out of my house even more confident than she had arrived. I considered that dinner a complete success. Over the next 2 weeks, something else slowly began to change. Nathan started drifting away from me. Our Sunday breakfasts became text messages. Our phone calls grew shorter. Every time I suggested meeting alone,
Olivia somehow already had other plans: wedding tastings, dance rehearsals, meetings with photographers, cake consultations. Nothing seemed suspicious enough for Nathan to question, but it was enough for me. She wasn't trying to keep me away from the wedding. She was trying to keep me away from my son. One evening, my phone rang just after sunset. Nathan. His voice sounded unusually uneasy. "Dad?" He hesitated. "Olivia thinks you've been acting differently." I asked, "Differently how?" Another pause. "She says you've been watching her, that you've been asking strange questions, that maybe you don't trust her." I stared through the kitchen window into my backyard before answering. "And what do you think?" Silence. Not the comfortable silence we'd shared throughout most of his life. This one carried uncertainty. Finally, he spoke. "I think," he stopped again, "I think maybe you're having trouble accepting that I'm starting my own family." Those weren't Nathan's words. They belonged to Olivia. She had simply placed them inside my son's mouth. Elizabeth had warned me this would happen. Real manipulation works best when people believe every thought belongs to them. "If that's what you believe," I answered quietly, "I'm not going to argue." Another long silence followed. Then Nathan sighed. "I still want you at the wedding." I asked the only question that mattered. "Does Olivia?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "She'll be okay with it." That wasn't what I'd asked. After we ended the call, I drove directly to Elizabeth's office. By then, every recording, every surveillance photograph, every sworn statement, every legal document had been organized into 3 identical evidence binders. Each section was indexed by date, source, and supporting documentation. Elizabeth reviewed them one last time before placing 2 copies inside a fireproof safe. She handed me the 3rd. "If anything happens to this one," she said, "the others remain protected." I slipped the binder into the same leather briefcase I had carried to engineering meetings for decades. It had traveled with me through hundreds of bridge inspections. This would become its most important assignment. Just before I left, Elizabeth asked the question neither of us wanted to face. "Richard," she looked directly at me, "are you prepared for the possibility that Nathan may still choose her after seeing everything?" I stood quietly for several seconds. "If he sees the truth," I took a slow breath, "and still decides to stay with her," I paused, "at least he'll be making his own decision, not living inside someone else's lie." Elizabeth slowly nodded. "Then we've done everything we can." 3 days later,
I buttoned my charcoal gray suit, picked up the leather briefcase, and drove toward a historic estate outside Bellevue where nearly 200 guests had gathered. As people filled the garden beneath clear summer skies, I realized something. I wasn't attending my son's wedding anymore. I was walking into the final chapter of an investigation that had consumed nearly 3 months of my life. What I didn't know was that Olivia was about to make one mistake so arrogant she would end up exposing herself without me needing to interrupt the ceremony. The wedding ended at exactly 3:47 that afternoon. Nathan kissed his bride while applause echoed across the garden. Nearly 200 guests smiled as they celebrated what they believed was the beginning of a beautiful marriage. I was the only person standing there who knew they had actually witnessed the final moments before everything came apart. I stayed exactly where I was during the photographs. I smiled whenever the photographer asked. I shook hands with relatives, accepted congratulations, thanked people for coming. Through it all, my leather briefcase never left my side. Olivia barely looked at me during the ceremony. She didn't need to. As far as she was concerned, she had already won. When everyone moved into the ballroom for the reception, I noticed something. She wasn't pretending quite as much anymore. She stayed close to Nathan whenever guests approached, but every few minutes she glanced toward me, almost as if she were waiting for the moment she could finally stop acting. Dinner ended. The best man's toast received enthusiastic applause. The band prepared for the couple's first dance. Then, Olivia quietly excused herself from a small group of guests. She walked directly toward my table. She never sat down. Instead, she leaned close enough that anyone watching would have assumed she was thanking her new father-in-law. Instead, she whispered, "It's over, Richard." I looked up without speaking. Her smile grew even wider. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You paid for the wedding. You welcomed me into the family. You even helped Nathan trust me more by pretending to support us." She paused, clearly enjoying every word. "Now it's time for you to disappear." I simply held her gaze. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She was celebrating. "Nathan and I need our own life," she continued softly. "No surprise visits, no opinions, no family dinners. You'll probably see us during holidays," she shrugged almost playfully, "if we happen to have time." Then she smiled again. "Men your age should know when they're no longer needed." I studied her face for several seconds. During my career, I'd watched steel beams bend under impossible pressure. I'd seen concrete fail after years of hidden damage, but I'd never watched confidence collapse as quickly as it did after 7 simple words. I adjusted my tie, smiled politely, and answered quietly enough that only she could hear. "I'll leave." I paused, "but I won't be leaving alone." Her smile vanished instantly. She blinked twice, trying to understand what I'd just said. "What does that mean?" I slowly stood, picked up my briefcase, buttoned my jacket. "You'll know," I glanced at my watch, "in about 10 minutes." For the first time since I'd met her, Olivia looked genuinely shaken. Her eyes darted toward Nathan across the ballroom before returning to me. "Whatever game you think you're playing, today is my wedding day. Don't embarrass yourself." I smiled once more, because for the first time I saw something I had never seen in her before. Fear. Not fear of me, fear of losing control. Without another word, I calmly walked toward the DJ's booth. Behind me, I could hear her heels striking the marble floor as she hurried after me. She was no longer smiling for the guests. The DJ looked up as I approached and immediately handed me the wireless microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a cheerful smile, "the groom's father would like to say a few words." Almost 200 conversations stopped at once. Nathan turned from the head table, wearing the warm expression of a son expecting nothing more than a traditional wedding toast. Olivia reached him a second later. She grabbed his arm so tightly I could see the color leave her knuckles. I walked to the center of the ballroom. The microphone rested in one hand, the leather briefcase remained in the other. Then I looked directly at my son. "Nathan, before I congratulate you, I need 10 minutes alone with you." The smile disappeared from his face. Around the ballroom, confused whispers spread from table to table. Olivia forced another pleasant smile. "Richard," she said, carefully raising her voice just enough for nearby guests to hear, "whatever this is, it can wait until tomorrow." I turned toward her. "No," I spoke quietly. "Tomorrow will already be too late." The ballroom became completely silent. Nathan looked from me to Olivia, then back again. He looked like a man standing at a crossroads without knowing which direction led home. Finally, he took a slow breath. 10 minutes, he said. Olivia immediately tightened her grip on his arm. "Absolutely not." Her voice was still polite, but the strain under it was impossible to miss. I gave him my word. It was the first time all afternoon he had openly disagreed. Without another word, I turned and walked toward a private library beside the ballroom. A moment later, Nathan followed. Just before the door closed behind us, Olivia hurried forward and tried to step inside. I raised my hand and blocked the doorway. "This conversation is between a father and his son. He's my husband now," she snapped. I nodded calmly. "Exactly. Which is why he deserves to hear this without someone speaking for him." Then I quietly closed the door. The room fell completely silent. Nathan folded his arms. Frustration covered his face. "Dad, you've already embarrassed everyone out there. Whatever this is, it better be worth it."
I placed the leather briefcase on the conference table, unlocked it,
then removed the first evidence binder. Everything inside had been carefully organized. Every page, every photograph, every statement, every recording. I looked directly at him. What you're about to see has been verified through licensed investigators, court records, sworn testimony, and public records. I opened the binder, then slid the first document toward him. A certified marriage certificate. Olivia Harper, married to Brandon Ellis. Nathan frowned. She told me she'd only been married once. Keep reading. He turned another page. Divorce settlement, financial distribution, timeline. Then another marriage certificate. Christopher Morgan, another divorce, another financial settlement. His eyes slowed as he reached the next section. He looked back at me. Dad, his voice had become almost a whisper. There's more? Without answering, I laid several photographs across the table. Olivia and Cameron Blake entering restaurants together, holding hands outside a boutique hotel, walking through downtown Seattle with their arms around each other. Every photograph carried both a date and a timestamp. Nathan picked one up. His eyes remained fixed on it, without blinking. This, his voice nearly disappeared. This was 4 days before we got engaged? I nodded once. Keep going. His hands were beginning to shake. I reached into the briefcase and removed the small digital recorder. After pressing play, Olivia's voice filled the room. Warm, friendly, professional. She was asking me about my retirement accounts, my trust, my home, whether I planned to revise my estate documents before the wedding. Nathan slowly looked up. You recorded her? Legally? Yes. I stopped the recording, opened the final section of the binder, then placed another recorder on the table. This recording wasn't made by me. The audio quality sounded rougher, but the voices were unmistakable. Olivia laughed softly. Then Cameron spoke. 12 more weeks, and everything falls into place. Nathan's face became completely still. The recording continued. He still doesn't suspect anything. Cameron's voice sounded relaxed. Olivia answered without hesitation. He won't. Once Richard updates his estate plan, everything eventually passes through Nathan, and then through us. Cameron laughed. You're getting better at this every year. Then came the sentence that emptied every trace of color from my son's face. By the time he realizes the marriage was only part of the plan, it'll already be too late. I stopped the recording. Silence settled over the room. Heavy, unmoving. Nathan stared at the recorder as though it had become something impossible to understand. Finally, he looked at me. His face had gone completely pale. He swallowed. That's really her voice. Yes. They called our marriage. He couldn't finish. Part of a plan. Yes. Slowly, he lowered himself into the nearest chair, covered his face with both hands. Nearly a full minute passed without either of us speaking. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were wet, but the confusion was gone. Only clarity remained. He quietly closed the binder, stood to his feet, walked toward the door. His hand rested on the handle for several seconds. Without turning around, he spoke. Dad. He swallowed hard. Don't say another word out there. Then he finally looked back at me. I'll end this myself. He opened the door and walked back into the reception hall alone. When Nathan stepped back into the ballroom alone, every head turned toward him. The music had already stopped. Conversations had faded into complete silence. Nearly 200 guests stood waiting for someone to explain why the groom had disappeared with his own father in the middle of his own reception. Olivia hurried toward him. Her smile returned instantly. It was polished, practiced, convincing.
She reached for his hand before he had taken more than 3 steps. "Nathan," she said softly, making sure nearby guests could hear her concern. "Let's forget whatever your father said. We have people waiting for us." He looked down at her hand resting on his arm. Then, without saying a single word, he gently removed it. It was such a small movement that most people probably overlooked it. I didn't. Neither did Olivia. For the first time all day, her confidence visibly cracked. "Nathan?" She forced another smile. He looked directly into her eyes. "How long?" She blinked. "What?" "How long have you and Cameron Blake been together?" For barely a second, her expression froze. Then she laughed. The sound felt forced. "Your father has filled your head with ridiculous stories." Nathan never reacted. "I asked you a question." Several guests quietly stood from their chairs. The best man slowly stepped backward. Even the wedding coordinator stopped moving. Olivia glanced around the ballroom, searching, calculating, looking for an escape that didn't exist. "He's a business associate. Nothing more." Nathan slowly nodded. "Then why were you spending nights with your business associate while planning our wedding?" The ballroom became so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud. Olivia's expression hardened. "So now your father is spying on me?" She pointed directly toward me. Nathan gently shook his head. "No, he was protecting me." Those 6 words struck me harder than I expected. Olivia realized she was losing control. Immediately, she changed strategies. Tears filled her eyes almost instantly. "Nathan, please." She reached toward him. "Your father never accepted me. He's manipulated everything because he can't stand the thought of losing you." Nathan quietly opened the evidence binder he had carried from the library. Without raising his voice, he removed the certified marriage certificates, then the hotel photographs, then the transcripts. One by one, he placed them across the head table where both families could see them. He looked back at Olivia. "Did my father manipulate these?" She stared at the documents. She didn't touch a single page. She knew exactly what they were. "Answer me." Silence. Nathan asked again. "Was our marriage part of a plan?" Still, nothing. Without another word, Nathan picked up his phone, pressed play.
Olivia's own voice echoed across the ballroom. 12 more weeks, and everything falls into place. Confused whispers immediately spread through the room. Then Cameron's voice followed. "Nathan still doesn't suspect anything." The recording continued for another 20 seconds. Nathan stopped it. He didn't need to play the rest. The damage had already been done. Olivia slowly looked around the ballroom. There wasn't a single friendly face left. Even her own parents couldn't meet her eyes. She took one desperate step toward Nathan. "I can explain." He slowly removed the wedding ring from his finger, then placed it beside the evidence binder. "No." His voice remained calm. "You can explain everything to your attorney." He turned toward the guests. "I'm truly sorry that all of you came here to celebrate a marriage that never should have happened." Then he looked at Olivia one final time. "This wedding is over." Without another word, he walked across the ballroom, stopped beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, for the first time in months, my son looked at me the same way he had when he was a little boy. Not because he needed me to solve his problems, because he finally understood why I had tried so hard to protect him. Behind us, Olivia shouted that we had destroyed her life. I never turned around. People who build their lives on deception almost always say the same thing when the truth finally catches them. 6 months have passed since that reception ended before the celebration had truly begun. Looking back, I barely remember the flowers, the music, the expensive dinner, or the decorations. What I remember is the moment my son chose the truth over the future he thought he wanted. Olivia tried to challenge the prenuptial agreement. She accused me of violating her privacy. She threatened lawsuits against everyone involved in the investigation. None of it survived the evidence. Every recording had been obtained legally. Every photograph carried verified timestamps. Every sworn statement from Brandon Ellis and Christopher Morgan matched the documents Michael Carter had uncovered. Faced with overwhelming proof, Olivia quietly withdrew every claim before the case ever reached trial. Only a few weeks later, Cameron Blake disappeared from Washington. Neither of them ever contacted my family again. Nathan rented a small apartment across town. He insisted on paying every bill himself. He returned every credit card I had ever given him, rejected every offer of financial assistance. "I need to know I can stand on my own," he told me one afternoon. For the first time in many months, I believed him. We rebuilt our relationship not through apologies. We rebuilt it through ordinary moments. Saturday breakfasts, fishing trips, long conversations that had nothing to do with lawyers, investigators, or betrayal. Trust didn't return overnight. It came back one honest choice at a time. One evening, while we sat beside the lake watching the sunset, Nathan asked the question I knew would eventually come. "Dad, why didn't you stop the wedding sooner?" I smiled quietly, because I had asked myself that same question countless times. "If I had tried to stop it with nothing more than my opinion, you would have spent the rest of your life wondering whether you lost the right woman because of me." I paused. "I needed you to discover the truth for yourself. Only then could the decision truly belong to you." Nathan nodded slowly. "You didn't just save me from a bad marriage." He looked across the water before finishing. "You saved me from spending the rest of my life defending the wrong person." Those words meant more to me than any legal victory ever could. Many people believe the greatest gift a parent can leave behind is money, property, or an inheritance. I disagree. The greatest gift is good judgment, the ability to recognize character before charm, truth before promises, actions before beautiful words. If my story leaves you with anything, let it be this: never trust someone simply because they always know exactly what to say. Trust the person whose actions remain honest even when no one else is watching.